What did it take to survive the Titanic's final hours if you were steerage? The answer lies in an unspoken contract: eat now, chat later. Third-class passengers navigated a delicate choreography of elbow taps and quick departures, all while sharing tables with strangers speaking dozens of languages. How did this rhythmic cooperation turn a crowded dining room into a refuge? We're breaking down the silent rules that kept chaos at bay, and how they failed when it mattered most. So, before you get comfortable, maybe pull your blanket a little tighter. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Titanic's third-class dining saloon. No hay bales underfoot, no livestock odours, just white-painted walls and the hum of electric lights. For many passengers fresh from rural villages or cramped tenements, this room marked their first taste of something resembling dignity at sea. The space felt disorientingly clean by 1912 standards. Just scrubbed wood and the faint metallic tang of steam from the galley. The partitions separating dining areas gave the illusion of privacy, while the upright chairs enforced better posture than any bunk below decks. Yet the upgrades had limits. The cutlery, though polished, was strictly utilitarian. No delicate silverware here. Lighting came from plain fixtures rather than crystal chandeliers. Passengers later recalled noticing how the room's simplicity made it easier to maintain order. Fewer fragile items meant fewer reasons for crew interference during meal rotations. This was a carefully calculated concession, not a true luxury. The White Star Line understood that letting third-class passengers believe they'd graduated to respectable status kept complaints down and turnover efficient. You might only have 10 minutes at the table before the next shift, but for those minutes you weren't livestock being transported. You were a paying customer using actual utensils. The psychological lift was palpable. Accounts mention immigrants sitting unusually straight in their chairs, carefully unfolding napkins that, even if rough by first-class standards, still represented a step above the bundled rags of their daily lives. An Estonian passenger wrote home that the dining room made us feel we hadn't been buried alive at the bottom of the ship. Key to the effect was the contrast with sleeping quarters. While the dining area was brightly lit and ventilated, third-class cabins maintained traditional steerage conditions. Families packed into windowless spaces barely large enough for their bunks, sharing the stale air with all their belongings. The dining room wasn't just a place to eat, it was an escape pod from the claustrophobia below. Crew members stood ready to enforce strict meal rotations, keeping the human conveyor belt moving. If you tried lingering over a second cup of tea, a steward's glance could shorten your break without a word. The porcelain might be chip-free, but it was always the same plain white set, just durable enough for industrial dishwashing between seatings. Fresh flowers appeared nowhere in third class. No musicians strolled between tables as they did upstairs. The salt cellars were bolted to the tables, like in a railway dining car, a precaution against rough seas and light fingers. Every detail whispered that while you'd been upgraded from steerage, you remained several social strata below guest status. For non-English speakers, the room created unspoken stresses. Menus and instructions came exclusively in English, turning simple meals into exercises in decoding. A Syrian passenger recalled using hand gestures across a language barrier to determine whether a neighbour had finished with the shared bread basket, all under the watch of stewards who didn't speak either tongue. Yet for all its limitations, the dining room's greatest power was its ability to make passengers behave as if they belonged there. The insistence on table manners created a self-enforcing culture. Anyone disrupting the fragile decorum faced disapproval, not just from crew, but from fellow diners invested in maintaining this fleeting dignity. It worked because the alternative, A return to the animalistic steerage stereotypes was unbearable. A Finnish woman travelling with children described coaching them through each utensil's proper use, not for the ship's benefit, but because, if we acted like civilized people, perhaps we'd be treated as such when we reached America. Wake in the dark cabin, splash your face at the shared sink, straighten your least wrinkled clothes, then queue quietly for the dining room's temporary sanctuary. No matter that lunch would be the same stew as yesterday and tomorrow, the act of eating it here, off proper dishes, mattered more than the food itself. This artificial construct couldn't last, of course. The same White Star Line efficiency that provided decent tableware also dictated locked gates when disaster struck, prioritizing lifeboat loading over dining room dignity. But for those days before the iceberg, the third-class dining saloon sold immigrants something more valuable than a transatlantic passage: proof they could carry themselves like the people they aspired to become. Hey guys, tonight we begin with breakfast, the kind that won't wow your taste buds but will keep you upright. Picture a steam-filled dining room at dawn, the clatter of spoons against thick porcelain bowls. This was porridge that clung to your ribs like tar, dense bread that could double as a doorstop, and tea strong enough to sterilize surgical tools. The bread deserved its own legend. Baker's journals from the era suggest it was intentionally overbaked. Crisp crusts protecting slightly stale interiors, designed to survive the humid ocean air. You didn't savor this bread so much as negotiate with it. Each dense slice required determined chewing, a workout for jaws that left passengers feeling they'd earned their calories. Yet it never went mouldy, even by the end of the voyage. Some historians argue it might have outlasted the ship. Margarine made its dubious debut here, scooped from tins with White Star Line logos pressed into the surface. It refused to melt properly, leaving waxy streaks on warm bread that fooled no one. Crew members called it butter's shy cousin in private. Passengers from dairy regions, Irish farmers, Swedish dairymaids, exchanged knowing looks as they scraped it thin across their bread, making the ration stretch while quietly mourning real butter. That tea was a different beast altogether. Brewed from the lowest grade leaves and boiled within an inch of its life, it arrived at tables dark as engine oil. The tannins could pucker your mouth shut, but the caffeine delivered. Mothers used it to revive seasick children. Labourers relied on it to shake off night shifts in the ship's belly. Sugar came in paper cones, doled out with calculating efficiency, enough to blunt the bitterness, not enough to spoil appetites for the coming meals. Porridge anchored the meal. Served lukewarm by design, hot enough to kill germs, cool enough to eat quickly. It took on whatever flavour you mixed in. Some stirred in their sugar ration for sweetness, others salted it heavily. A few resourceful travellers hoarded jam from supper the night before to swirl in. The meal's brilliance lay in its predictability. Every morning, the same bowls in the same spots, same tin spoons, same bread knives bolted to tables with rust-proof chains. For immigrants who'd faced hunger back home, Irish escaping famine, Eastern Europeans fleeing crop failures, this mechanical reliability meant more than any delicacy could. A Swedish teenager's diary entry captured it. 3 days now, the bread tastes identical. Tables became micro-societies each dorm. Without assigned seating, groups developed silent territories. Finnish families clustered near the portside windows. Single Italian labourers commandeered the centre tables. Syrian traders occupied a corner where they could speak freely. Children learned to nibble crusts first, saving softer centres for last. Elderly passengers received the least scorched porridge portions without discussion. Utensils performed double duty. Spoons scraped last bits from bowls, then became impromptu teaching tools for parents demonstrating English words to children. Knives spread dubious margarine, then sketched maps of the new world on breadcrumb canvases. Even the thick teacups sheltered secrets, rolled up notes tucked beneath them, small treasures hidden until the right table mate appeared. Speed governed everything. With limited seating and strict meal rotations, Passengers mastered eating quickly without appearing rushed. A vernacular of gestures evolved. A lifted spoon signalled, "Pass the bread," 2 fingers tapped on porcelain meant, "I'm done with this bowl." Slovenian miners and English factory workers who shared no common language developed these codes effortlessly, united by the universal urgency of institutional dining. The galley's rhythm ruled them all. Clanging pots and shouted orders filtered through the serving hatches, reminding diners of the machinery behind their meal. When the steam from the kitchen grew suddenly thicker, experienced travellers knew to eat faster. A fresh shift of passengers would arrive within minutes. Breakfast wasn't leisure here. It was fuel measured out by the ounce and minute. Oddly, this pressure created solidarity. Watching others navigate the same challenges, passengers formed unspoken alliances. A Lithuanian grandmother might wordlessly take over cutting bread for a frazzled Danish mother with twin toddlers. Greek labourers taught Serbian teens how to cradle hot bowls in folded napkins to avoid burns. The shared struggle against the clock made translators out of people who'd never exchanged words. Children adapted fastest. By day 3, even 5-year-olds could dismantle a bread loaf efficiently, crusts torn into shareable strips, centre-cubed for easier buttering. They learned which stewards allowed extra tea refills and which enforced portions to the drop. Some became experts at scavenging abandoned sugar packets from vacant seats, building tiny stashes for harder days. Adults compensated where they could. Men who'd brought liquor flasks from home donated drops to fortify particularly awful tea batches. Women with sewing kits turned napkins into makeshift bibs for messy eaters. The breakfast rush paradoxically became the day's most communal moment, too hectic for hostility, too structured for conflict. This wasn't fine dining, but it was ingenious social engineering. The White Star Line had calculated exactly how much comfort third-class passengers needed to avoid mutiny, and not an ounce more. That tea's bitterness, just mild enough to swallow. That bread's density, adequate to prevent mid-morning hunger pangs without requiring expensive toppings. Even the margarine ration, precisely measured to leave you wanting exactly one more slice than you received. Complaining meant risking banishment from the dining room to eating cramped berths. Praise might invite reduced portions, so they maintained perfect equilibrium, grateful enough to avoid trouble, critical enough to keep standards from slipping further. An unspoken agreement between served and server. This is bearable, and we will bear it. By breakfast's end, everyone had ingested enough caffeine and starch to face another unpredictable day at sea. Bowls and cups were scraped cleaner than any health inspector would believe. The dining staff's greatest pride wasn't compliments received, but waste avoided. Each crumb counted, each drop accounted for. Third-class survival wasn't about luxury. It was about consistency, reliability, and learning to swallow life's lesser margarines with your bread. Now, let's talk about the star of the show, the stew. You'd recognize it by smell before it reached your table. That thick aroma of boiled meat and root vegetables drifting from the galley hatches. It appeared under different names depending on the menu. Rotation beef stew, mutton stew, vegetable stew. But the foundation remained unchanged. Whatever protein scraps survived the voyage longest, chopped beyond recognition into a thick gravy clinging to chunks of carrot, potato, and turnip. The soup course came first, a clear broth that tested your patience. Thin enough to see light through, stronger on salt than flavour, it existed mainly to stretch the meal while filling stomachs. The first bite burned your tongue if you weren't careful. The 10th bite would still be steaming. Potatoes formed the stew's backbone, boiled separately, then added last to avoid disintegration. Cooks left the skins on for texture and nutrition, knowing passengers from agrarian backgrounds would expect nothing less. What passed for meat varied by the ship's provisions. Beef scraps were prized but rare, more common on early voyage days when fresh stores lasted. By week's end, the darker, gamier mutton dominated, requiring extra boiling to tenderize sinewy cuts. Fish made occasional appearances, though never in the form passengers might recognize. Chopped into the mix, it lent a briny undertone that divided tables. Scandinavians welcomed the change, while Eastern Europeans pushed suspiciously at their bowls. The vegetables behaved predictably. Carrots softened into sweetness. Turnips held their shape but lost all character. Onions dissolved entirely, leaving only their pungent ghost in the broth. What the stew lacked in refinement, it compensated for in resilience. A well-made batch could survive hours in the serving tins without separating or congealing, critical for staggered meal shifts. The gravy's thickness wasn't accidental, just viscous enough to coat a spoon without dripping, allowing passengers to scoop every calorie during their rushed meals. Passengers tore hunks to mop up gravy, a communal act that required coordination at packed tables. You learned to gauge your neighbour's pace, dip too soon, and you'd interrupt their next bite, wait too long, and you'd miss the gravy entirely. The galley staff took quiet pride in their stew, knowing it carried more responsibility than any first-class dish. While upstairs chefs sculpted delicate pastries, these cooks battled physics to keep hundreds of gallons at serving temperature without burning or thinning. Their secret weapon: industrial-sized steam kettles that circulated heat evenly, preventing the scorched bottom layer that plagued smaller pots. Portion control became an art form. Too little stew caused unrest, too much encouraged waste. Servers developed an eye for adjusting ladle depths based on a passenger's size and apparent hunger. Children received slightly thicker helpings near the bones where the most nutrients gathered. Elderly passengers got more tender vegetables. Able-bodied men took whatever remained, often the greasiest top layer with floating fat pockets. Dining etiquette developed around the stew's challenges. Blowing on it cooled the broth but risked spraying neighbours. Stirring too vigorously could splash your shirt with indelible grease stains. The safest technique involved pressing your spoon gently against the bowl's edge to skim a cooled layer, a manoeuvre immigrants from different continents somehow all discovered independently. Condiments were few but strategic. Salt cellars appeared on every table, necessary for reviving flavours dulled by prolonged cooking. Vinegar bottles made occasional rounds, their acid cutting through the stew's fattiness. Mustard existed mostly for show, the expensive imported kind reserved for higher classes, but a few savvy travellers brought their own spices hidden in handkerchiefs. The stew's monotony spawned creativity. Italian passengers crumbled dried herbs over their portions. Finns stirred in precious pats of butter saved from breakfast. Syrians carried small cloth bundles of za'atar to sprinkle as they ate. These tiny acts of resistance transformed identical meals into personal statements without slowing the dining rotation. Its true power emerged during rough seas. When plate rails couldn't prevent spills, the stew's thick consistency minimized disasters. Unlike watery soups that sloshed onto laps, a well-made stew only trembled in its bowl, moving as one gelatinous mass that mostly stayed put. Passengers learned to brace their arms against the table during swells, creating a stable platform for careful eating. Competition occasionally flared over meat distribution. Everyone understood that the choicest chunks settled near the bottom, leading to strategic scooping. Polite diners took from the top first, others angled spoons vertically, like miners excavating treasure. Crew members intervened when disputes arose, typically by depositing an extra scoop that stopped arguments without addressing fairness. Even without assigned seating, passengers gravitated toward familiar companions who shared their eating pace. A Finnish family might align meals with Swedish neighbours who understood silent breaks between helpings. Serbian labourers timed bites with Greek workers who appreciated methodical chewing. These unspoken alliances made the dining experience feel personalised, despite the industrial setting. Clean plates weren't just encouraged, they were economically essential. Every ounce of uneaten stew represented lost profit in the shipping company's ledgers. Passengers who consistently left food found their portions shrinking incrementally, an elegant form of negative reinforcement. Mothers trained children to scrape bowls completely, using bread as edible squeegees. When the meal ended, the stew's legacy continued in unseen ways. Its rich fats coated stomachs, slowing digestion to stave off hunger for hours. The salt content encouraged water intake, keeping dehydration at bay in the ship's dry interior. Even the meat's toughness had benefits. Prolonged chewing gave the brain time to register fullness, preventing overconsumption of limited supplies. As the voyage progressed, the stew became a barometer for remaining provisions. Passengers noted subtle changes: more potatoes, fewer carrots, increasing gristle, that hinted at dwindling stocks. Yet its core identity never faltered. However bare the pantry became, the kitchen ensured the stew retained enough substance to satisfy. For all its humble nature, this single dish may have done more than any lifeboat drill to maintain order aboard the crowded lower decks. But the stew's greatest success was psychological. However monotonous, it represented security. However plain, it never failed to appear. However variable the ingredients, it always delivered warmth and calories exactly when needed. In a world of locked gates and unspoken hierarchies, the stew remained democratic equal portions, served with the same disinterested efficiency to all who queued properly. Eventually, passengers stopped questioning what floated in their bowls. They simply ate, grateful for the routine, the warmth, the temporary ceasefire from the journey's uncertainties. The stew wouldn't save them when crisis came, but for those ordinary days at sea, it held body and soul together as reliably as rivets held the hull. So, before you get comfortable, imagine a bar where alcohol was scarce and tea ruled. The White Star Line didn't prohibit liquor in third class, but they made it inconvenient enough that only the determined would bother. While first-class passengers enjoyed proper bars with crystal decanters, steerage got a narrow counter near the galley where the ship's bureaucracy dictated the rules. No comfortable stools here, just a standing-only arrangement designed to discourage lingering. You ordered from a menu written entirely in English, even if you'd never spoken a word of it. The tea came already sugared unless you knew to ask otherwise. Lemon slices appeared sometimes, vanished others, following no logic passengers could discern. Crew members referred to this area with a smirk as the teetotaler's playground, though sharp eyes would notice certain stewards always seemed to have flasks tucked in their waistbands. Only 2 beer taps served the entire third-class contingent, placed deliberately far from the dining areas. Getting a pint required navigating a maze of corridors and staircases, ensuring most passengers wouldn't attempt the trek during their limited free time. Those who made the pilgrimage often found the taps mysteriously empty right after shift changes or during peak dining hours. Passengers adapted with dark humour. Grown men would clink teacups like fine whiskey glasses, toasting to Navy-strength tea with exaggerated winces at the bitterness. Women hid tiny bottles of medicinal tonics in their skirts, actual prescriptions that happened to be 80 proof. The Irish in particular developed an elaborate pantomime around the sugar bowls, stirring with exaggerated motions while discreetly adding liquor from concealed flasks. Crew members pretended not to notice the suddenly aromatic tea at certain tables. What the third-class bar lacked in alcohol, it compensated for in social function. Unlike the dining room with its rotation schedule, this space allowed uninterrupted conversation. Men swapped tobacco they'd smuggled aboard in waterproof tins. Women compared notes on which stewards might accidentally bring the wrong pot from first class. The cramped conditions forced strangers into close proximity, breaking down language barriers through gestures and shared cups. The tea itself became a character in these interactions. Brewed from the cheapest leaves and stewed for hours on industrial warmers, it developed a tannic punch that left your mouth dry. Regulars learned to request milk early before it ran out, or to time their visits between fresh batches when the bitterness became manageable. The sugar rationing created camaraderie, Seasoned travellers knew to bring their own if they wanted more than a teaspoon, and quietly shared with those who didn't. Coffee existed in theory but rarely in practice. When available, it came pre-mixed with chicory in a cost-saving blend that tasted faintly of burnt grain. At least the tannins provided a consistent experience, unlike the unpredictable coffee that might taste passable one day and like bilge water the next. Ice represented forbidden luxury in third class. While upstairs passengers enjoyed chilled beverages, steerage drank everything at room temperature or hotter. The few who requested ice were told it was for medical use only, unless they slipped a steward some coins. Then suddenly, a few precious cubes might appear, wrapped in a napkin to avoid dripping evidence as they were smuggled to waiting glasses. Glassware itself was a point of contention. Third-class passengers received thick mugs that couldn't shatter easily, unlike the delicate tumblers of upper decks. Someone had clearly done the math. These vessels weighed exactly enough to discourage theft, while still feeling vaguely substantial in the hand. They developed hairline cracks quickly though, requiring constant replacement from a hidden stash the bartenders guarded like treasure. Cash changed hands rarely at the counter. Most drinks were covered by the ticket price, within reason. But an underground economy flourished for special requests, passengers with skills, a tailor who could fix uniforms, a carpenter who repaired furniture, found their tea somehow stayed hot longer. Their sugar rations mysteriously doubled. Everyone understood these transactions without discussing them openly. The bar's layout encouraged movement, not comfort. No chairs meant people circulated constantly, creating a low murmur of conversations in a dozen languages. This forced rotation had an unintended benefit. It prevented cliques from dominating prime spaces while allowing recurring characters to pass through like actors in a play. You'd see the same faces daily, but always in slightly different configurations. Certain tables became known for particular trades. Near the portside windows, card games flourished among French and Italian labourers. The aft corner hosted quiet discussions between Syrian merchants comparing customs forms. A central spot by the serving hatch became the domain of Scandinavian families trading tips about American ports. Crew members knew to check these areas first when searching for specific passengers. Children weren't forbidden from the space, though they received careful supervision. Those who did enter discovered an unexpected perk. The bartenders kept a hidden tin of rock candy for well-behaved youngsters. A few pieces would appear magically in a child's palm if they waited patiently while parents talked. This small kindness bought countless hours of good behaviour from bored kids trapped on board. Tea time developed its own rituals. Savvy travellers learned to arrive just before the official serving hours, when leftovers from first-class service might still be available. Others timed their visits for late evenings when exhausted stewards were more likely to overlook a flask's contents. Groups took turns sending one member to queue so the others could hold tables. A system that only worked because everyone respected the unspoken rule against saving spots indefinitely. Health restrictions created odd constraints. Anyone caught sneezing too conspicuously might find their beverage served scalding hot by a steward wielding medical authority. The same went for passengers nursing visible injuries. Their drinks arrived with strict instructions about doctors' orders. No one challenged these interventions, though the medical advice coincidentally aligned with the staff's desire to avoid contagions. Smoking followed its own peculiar code. While no signs prohibited tobacco, the lack of ashtrays sent a clear message. Regulars brought makeshift tins from home or repurposed empty food cans. Newcomers learned quickly after getting frowns for flicking ash on the floor. The best seats for smokers clustered near ventilation shafts, creating a perpetual breeze that carried both smoke and confidential conversations away from prying ears. Seasoned travellers carried their own solutions. A well-prepared immigrant might pack a personal tea infuser, dried herbs, or even small citrus fruits to augment the ship's provisions. These items became social currency offer, a slice of dried orange to a neighbour's cup, and you might receive a pinch of precious cinnamon in return. Such tiny luxuries transformed ordinary tea into something resembling a shared feast. The bar's true value emerged during rough weather. When high seas sent passengers retreating from unstable dining tables, this standing-only space became oddly stable. The lack of chairs meant nothing could tip over, and the sturdy counter provided something to grip during swells. Here, in this unlikely haven, third-class passengers could ride out storms with a warm drink in hand and new friends at their elbows. Entertainment was strictly DIY. No ship's musicians visited third class, so passengers made their own fun. Harmonicas appeared from pockets, dice games unfolded on napkins, and newspapers became prized communal possessions. The bartenders tolerated this within reason, though any activity that slowed drink turnover earned subtle discouragement. A suddenly slower refill pace, or lost sugar cubes for that table. Lighting reinforced the hierarchy. Unlike the glittering chandeliers of first-class bars, third-class made do with plain electric bulbs in metal cages. The harsh illumination left no glamorous shadows, but it served its purpose, keeping everything visible to the stewards monitoring from their posts. Night brought no atmospheric dimming here. The light stayed bright until the official closing time, then cut off abruptly. Closing time itself was a masterpiece of passive enforcement. No bells or announcements marked last call. The staff simply began noisily cleaning mugs and wiping surfaces an hour beforehand. As supplies dwindled, so did the drink quality, until only the most desperate would accept the dregs left in the warming urns. By the official hour, the space was usually empty through sheer lack of appeal, rather than any confrontational eviction. Yet for all its calculated discomforts, the third-class bar served its purpose. It provided neutral ground, where divides of language and nationality softened over shared cups. Here, a Finnish farmer might pantomime a joke to an Armenian trader, while an Italian labourer laughed despite understanding neither. The rituals of pouring, stirring and sipping created order where chaos might have taken hold. No one mistook this for a real tavern. But for passengers weary of their cramped quarters or the dining room's strict rotations, the bar offered something just as valuable. A few unscripted hours where they could pretend they were travellers, not cargo. The tea might be terrible, the rules absurd, and the company unpredictable, but it was undeniably human. And on a ship that would soon test everyone's humanity to its limits, that counted for more than anyone realised. Let's be clear, the galley was the true heart of third-class survival. While passengers focused on their meals in the dining room, an industrial ballet unfolded below decks. The space resembled a steam-powered factory, more than a kitchen cauldrons large enough to bathe a cow. Bread pans the size of sledges, and knives sharpened hourly to keep up with relentless prep work. This was where the White Star Line's promises of regular meals either became reality or failed spectacularly. The scale defied logic. Serving 700 people required military precision with civilian resources. Cooks worked in rotating shifts around the clock, their faces permanently flushed from heat and exertion. You could identify galley veterans by their forearms, crisscrossed with small burns from splattering grease and steam vents. These weren't artists crafting delicate dishes, but endurance athletes in aprons, racing against the ship's rigid meal schedule. Steam kettles dominated the workspace, their copper surfaces dented from constant use. Each held enough stew to feed a small village, kept at serving temperature by pressurized pipes running along the ceiling. The cooks developed intimate relationships with these beasts, knowing exactly which valve hissed before erupting, which corner accumulated scum needing skimming. Stirring required wooden paddles resembling canoe oars, wielded with both hands for proper leverage. Bread production became its own relentless cycle. The mixing troughs could accommodate a grown man lying down, proofing cabinets resembled wardrobes, and baking sheets entered ovens on rails like minecarts. Dough rose in staggered batches around the clock, ensuring fresh bread at every meal, despite the staggering volume needed. Cooks joked grimly that if the ship sank, the floating loaves could form a makeshift life raft. Vegetable prep created its own special hell. Sacks of potatoes arrived daily from the refrigerated hold, each needing peeling before their starch turned dark. Teams of kitchen boys, some no older than 14, worked in rotating shifts at long tables, their knives flashing under hanging lights. The floor stayed perpetually damp from rinse water, forcing workers to wear cork-soled shoes that suctioned against the tile with each step. Meat butchery happened behind a screened-off section, more for psychological comfort than hygiene. What entered as whole carcasses left as precisely portioned scraps, with every usable bit rendered for broth or minced beyond recognition. The gristle and bone fragments went to separate pots, boiling down into gelatinous stock that gave the stew its body. Nothing was wasted when feeding this many mouths on profit margins. No delicate jars of imported seasonings here, just industrial tins labelled in block letters: salt, pepper, vinegar. Larger drums held dried herbs purchased by the hundredweight, their aromas dulled by months at sea. Cooks measured with rough handfuls, knowing precise seasoning mattered less than consistent salinity across hundreds of servings. Dishwashing became its own nightmare assembly line. Teams worked in rotating shifts at sinks, deep enough to submerge serving trays, scalding their hands in water hot enough to kill germs, but not so hot it warped the cheap tin plates. The drying racks resembled vertical file cabinets, each compartment sized exactly for stacks of identical bowls. A single broken piece meant reshuffling the entire system. Sound defined the space as much as smells. The constant metallic clang of pots, hissing steam valves, and shouted orders created a din that left new workers temporarily deaf after shifts. Seasoned hands developed lip-reading skills and elaborate hand signals to communicate across the noise. The rhythm became hypnotic, like some terrible mechanical heartbeat keeping time with the ship's engines. Heat turned the galley into a punishment detail. Even in April crossing, temperatures near the ovens could induce heat stroke. Workers drank tepid water from shared dippers, their thirst never quite quenched. The ship's designers had prioritized insulation over ventilation, trapping every degree of warmth from the cooking surfaces. Some fainted mid-shift, dragged out by colleagues to recover in cooler passageways. Water rationing created constant tension. The same pipes supplying drinking fountains had to fill cooking pots and rinse vegetables. Engineers had calculated exactly how many gallons per meal the operations required, with no margin for spills or improvisation. Cooks became expert at judging water levels by ear, knowing the precise pitch a kettle made when optimally filled. Coordination with dining stewards required telepathic timing. Without phones or intercoms, runners darted between decks carrying cryptic notes about schedule changes. A late bread batch or delayed soup service rippled through the entire operation, forcing recalculations on the fly. The best cooks could mentally adjust 5 different meal components simultaneously when delays occurred. Innovation happened through desperation, not inspiration. When the potato peeler broke, kitchen boys improvised with barrel lids and nails. Missing ladles became replaced with cleaned coal scoops. A shortage of clean towels meant bakers used flour sacks as makeshift pot holders, their rough fabric leaving fibers in every dish. Necessity bred dangerous creativity at times. Like the ill-advised attempt to strain soup through a spare uniform shirt. Sanitation walked a razor's edge. Supplies of lye soap were strictly controlled, forcing workers to stretch each bar. Inspection logs show frequent citations for improvised cleaning solutions, mostly seawater and vinegar blends that left everything smelling vaguely pickled. Rat sightings went officially unrecorded after the first week, though nocturnal traps needed regular emptying. The human cost rarely surfaced in company records. Burns, cuts and scalds were considered routine. Workers either continued their shift or forfeited pay. The ship's doctor kept a special ointment for galley injuries, a thick salve that smelled of tar and numbed pain just long enough to finish a shift. Some developed permanent tics from constant noise exposure. Others lost portions of fingerprints to hot surfaces. Meal quality fluctuated with the voyage's length. Early days featured occasional fresh vegetables and identifiable meat chunks. As supplies dwindled, the stew thickened with extra flour, while mysterious filler ingredients appeared: barley, lentils, anything to maintain volume. The cooks took no pleasure in this decline, but company policy prioritized consistent portions over consistency of taste. Beverage service required its own standalone operation. Tea urns needed constant refilling, their valves prone to clogging from loose leaves. The brewing process was more extraction than infusion bags, steeped until the liquid turned opaque, then held at near boiling to prevent bacterial growth. Workers developed calloused fingers from handling scalding tap handles hour after hour. Bread distribution followed arcane rules. Day-old loaves went to early breakfast service while still edible. Fresher batches were reserved for later meals when management feared passenger complaints. The scoring system for bread quality would baffle modern bakers, some marks indicating which ovens produced better crusts, others tallying how many batches each worker had completed. Fuel considerations shaped every decision. Coal consumption for cooking was carefully monitored against ship speed and weather. During rough seas, when engines burned extra fuel, galley supervisors received memos ordering conservation measures, code for slightly cooler ovens and abbreviated baking times that yielded denser, less appetizing bread. The plating process reflected brutal efficiency. Servers ladled stew with exactly 7 seconds per bowl, their movements perfected through repetition. Bread portions were weighed in advance, stacked on trays according to mathematical projections of consumption rates. Even the salt cellars were refilled on a strict rotation based on which tables used the most seasoning. Breakdowns happened with alarming frequency. Ovens developed hotspots that burned entire batches if not carefully managed. Dishwashing pumps clogged routinely with food scraps, requiring shutdowns while someone dismantled pipes choking with congealed grease. Staff meals revealed the hierarchy's hypocrisy. While officially eating the same provisions as third-class passengers, galley workers knew which batches to avoid. The oversalted stew destined for complaints, the bread from ovens needing recalibration. Their real meals came from clever pilferage, extra bits salvaged during prep, or the occasional entire chicken lost during inventory checks. Morale survived through dark humor. Workers placed bets on which passenger would complain first each meal. They nicknamed particularly vile batches of stew after hated officers. Someone painted a tiny mustache on the portrait of the White Star Line chairman hanging near the sinks, leaving it just subtle enough to avoid reprimand, while providing daily amusement. The galley's relationship with time grew surreal. Without natural light, workers lived by the ship's bell system and their own circadian collapse. Night shifts blended into days, marked only by meal turnovers and the changing roster of stewards collecting trays. Some reported losing all sense of whether they'd been at sea for 3 days or 5, their world reduced to the next batch needing preparation. Supplies arrived through a Byzantine chain of custody. Dry goods came up from holds via dumbwaiters, while last-minute produce appeared from refrigerated rooms nobody quite knew the location of. The manifests were deliberately vague. Preserved meats might mean anything from decent ham to questionably aged mutton. Cooks learned to inspect each delivery with skeptical eyes. The disaster, when it came, revealed the system's fragility. As the ship listed, pots slid from their stations, scattering half-cooked meals across the floors. Kettles overturned, searing workers who desperately tried to secure equipment. Someone had the presence of mind to shut off main steam valves, preventing catastrophic ruptures that could have scalded everyone instantly. In the end, what's remarkable isn't that the system failed that night, but that it worked at all beforehand. Against physics and probability, This sweaty, swearing, exhausted machine had produced thousands of meals with brutal efficiency. The third-class dining experience, that fragile illusion of civilization, rested entirely on the calloused hands and burnt forearms of people whose names history never recorded. That the Titanic's kitchens functioned even briefly at such scale remains a testament to human ingenuity under constraints. No automation, no safety protocols, just bodies and wills pushed beyond reasonable limits. The same stubbornness that kept workers chopping vegetables while their shoes filled with icy water had, until that final night, kept 700 strangers fed through a journey that should have been unbearable. Yet for all its flaws, the galley embodied something unexpectedly noble. However impersonal the servings, however cynical the management, actual human hands had prepared each bowl of stew, each slice of bread. The food might have been industrial in scale, but it wasn't extruded by machines. It bore the marks, and occasional blood or sweat, of people who understood what hunger looked like. This fragile system didn't just feed bodies, it sustained the illusion of order, just long enough for passengers to pretend they weren't livestock being transported. The real miracle wasn't the food's quality, but its relentless, unquestioning availability. Until suddenly, catastrophically, it wasn't. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most surprising part, the silence. You'd expect a room packed with immigrants from a dozen countries to be a cacophony of languages. Finnish farmers debating with Italian labourers, Syrian merchants haggling in Arabic, Swedish families chattering over their children's heads. But Titanic's third-class dining saloon maintained an eerie quiet beneath the clatter of silverware. This wasn't about shyness. The room operated on an unspoken contract that everyone intuitively understood: eat now, chat later. With limited seating and strict meal rotations, there simply wasn't time for lengthy conversations. You learned to communicate through gestures, a tap on the table to pass bread, an empty bowl pushed slightly forward to signal you were done. These micro-interactions became a universal language more effective than any shared vocabulary. The seating arrangements formed their own social algorithm without any official planning. Scandinavians clustered near the portholes where light was best for reading warm Bibles. Irish families claimed centre tables where they could keep an eye on wandering children. Single men from Eastern Europe dominated the corners nearest the exits, ready to bolt for a smoke between courses. Everyone respected these invisible boundaries without discussion. Food became the great equalizer. When the stew arrived in its steaming tureens, class divisions briefly dissolved. A Hungarian grandmother could demonstrate proper dumpling technique to a curious Norwegian teenager without speaking a word of her language. A Lebanese trader might share his personal spice blend with bemused Scottish shipbuilders through simple pantomime. The universal need to eat created makeshift translators out of spoon-wielding hands. Drinking rituals eased tensions too. Tea poured at precise angles to indicate refill requests. Sugar lumps carefully split between new parents and elderly travellers who needed the energy. Even the way you held your mug communicated information. Tilting it slightly meant you were almost finished, while leaving it upright signalled you wanted seconds despite the rules. Children proved surprisingly adaptable to this silent system. They quickly learned which adults would covertly slip them extra bread crusts, or turn a blind eye to sticky fingers reaching across plates. Games developed around the mealtime constraints. Who could stack empty bowls the highest before a steward noticed? Which toddler could mimic proper utensil use for approving nods from neighbouring tables? The ship's physical design encouraged this pragmatic peace. Long communal tables made private conversations impossible anyway. Benches rather than chairs forced close quarters that discouraged hostility. Even the tableware played its part, all identical plain white dishes that removed any notions of favouritism or status. When everyone eats from the same chipped bowls, arguments over place settings seem pointless. Language barriers sometimes cracked under pressure. Emergency translations would erupt when someone choked or burned their tongue. Suddenly polyglot passengers surfaced from the crowd to help. A Greek sailor might find himself explaining first aid in broken English to a panicked Polish mother, while an Algerian waiter rushed for water. These moments revealed the hidden linguistic talent spread throughout the room. Certain foods required pantomimed instructions. Few Syrian travellers had encountered porridge before, leading to comical demonstrations of proper stirring technique from Scottish miners. Even something as simple as salting eggs became a cultural exchange when the Norwegian method differed from the Spanish approach. The crew subtly encouraged this cooperation. Stewards would seat confused newcomers beside experienced travellers who knew the routines. Extra bread might mysteriously appear at tables where tensions were rising. When minor disputes did occur, someone taking too large a serving or hogging the salt cellar, Finnish children learned to chew with closed mouths by watching proper English ladies at adjacent tables. Young men adjusted their notoriously loud eating habits after catching disapproving looks from immigrant matriarchs. Even burping conventions had to be navigated. In some cultures, a compliment to the cook, in others, a grievous insult. The system began breaking down near voyage's end. As supplies dwindled and food quality declined, the silent cooperation grew strained. Larger families started guarding their territory more aggressively. Generosity with condiments became rarer. You could chart rising tensions by watching how violently people stirred their cooling tea. Weather played havoc with the fragile dynamic. During rough seas, when meals became maritime obstacle courses, frustration eroded civility. A spilled bowl that would normally merit sympathetic nods now drew glares. The usual tolerance for language barriers thinned when simple requests for napkins or water got lost in translation during storms. Even music followed the dining room's unwritten codes. When someone produced a harmonica or accordion, they instinctively played songs with universal appeal, simple folk melodies that crossed cultures. An Irish jig might morph into a Russian dance tune when the player noticed Slavic feet tapping along. The music never grew loud enough to disrupt the eating rhythm, just enough to ease the silence between bites. Some cultural differences proved irreducible. Eastern Europeans found British tea prep absurdly weak, but learned to discreetly steep their own leaves longer. Italians recoiled at the idea of margarine but accepted it with theatrical grimaces that made their neighbours laugh. These small acts of resistance worked precisely because they were playful rather than confrontational. Jewish passengers needed to navigate dietary restrictions without calling attention to themselves. Catholics quietly abstained from meat on Fridays despite ship's provisions. No one demanded special treatment, but accommodations happened through silent consensus. Fruit appearing at certain place settings, crew members pretending not to notice uneaten pork chops. Ironically, this system prepared passengers better than any safety drill for the coming disaster. They'd spent days practicing rapid non-verbal communication under stress. That ability to interpret subtle gestures and act cooperatively without discussion would soon mean the difference between reaching a lifeboat or not. Yet for all its functionality, the arrangement couldn't mask deeper inequalities. Passengers might share tables equally, but their fates were never truly equal. However cooperative the Swedish carpenter and Sicilian fruit seller became over shared meals, the ship's hierarchy would scatter them when crisis came. The dining room's democracy was always temporary, but for those brief meal times, it convinced them otherwise. The illusion worked because everyone needed it to. The Finnish widow and Lebanese teenager breaking bread together both wanted to believe in a world where effort and decency mattered more than passports and pronunciation. In few other spaces aboard Titanic could complete. Strangers developed such complex coordination without ever learning each other's names. This silent commerce of nods and gestures became its own immigrant experience, different from the villages they'd left, distinct from the cities they'd dreamed of, but somehow preparing them for both. The Atlantic may have separated their homelands, but Titanic's long tables forced them to bridge the gaps 3 times daily. They emerged, not as countrymen perhaps, but as something equally valuable on a voyage into the unknown, reliable dining partners who knew when to pass the salt without being asked. Now, let's talk about the final meal. April 14th supper unfolded like every other evening in third class, with the same scrape of spoons against bowls, the same ritual passing of bread baskets. Passengers joked about gaining weight from ship's rations by the time they reached New York, completely unaware these plates would be their last on board. The dining room's usual quiet hum gave no hint that history's worst maritime disaster was just hours away. The menu followed the White Star Line's reliable formula. Stew formed the centerpiece, thickened with extra flour to stretch dwindling meat supplies. Boiled potatoes maintained their comforting monotony, skins left on for texture and substance. Some accounts suggest fresh bread made an appearance that night, though whether due to actual improvement or wistful memory remains unclear. The meal wasn't about impressing anyone, just maintaining the fragile equilibrium that had held for 4 days across the Atlantic. Laughter broke through more frequently than usual. Near one corner, a couple shared news of their engagement with table mates. A boy demonstrated his new harmonica skills between mouthfuls of potatoes. When tea spilled on a child, the resulting fuss drew amused attention rather than annoyed glances. These ordinary human moments gained eerie significance in hindsight, final sparks of joy before the darkness. Conversations turned toward the future with unusual persistence. Passengers compared notes about New York boarding houses, debated where to find work, fantasized about first meals on solid ground. The usual careful budgeting talk gave way to small indulgences, maybe splurging on real butter once ashore, or treating children to fresh fruit. Hope flowed more freely than it had all voyage, as if the nearing destination loosened tongues and wallets alike. The dining room's unspoken rules relaxed slightly. Even the tea tasted marginally better, or perhaps passengers simply sipped it with more appreciation now. That careful balance between efficiency and comfort tipped briefly toward the latter, though nobody could say why. The children sensed the shift before adults did. They wriggled under tables with less restraint, played more openly with fork and spoon arrangements. One girl collected slices of bread to construct elaborate edible towers, a game that would have earned scolding earlier in the voyage. Tonight, adults only chuckled and passed her more building materials. The usual rigid mealtime discipline softened into something resembling an actual family dinner. Old tensions between national groups eased noticeably. Language barriers that had seemed impenetrable days before now collapsed under shared excitement. A Finnish farmer pantomimed his plans for an American farm to Italian labourers, who understood nothing of cold climate agriculture, but nodded enthusiastically anyway. Syrian merchants shared dates saved from Mediterranean ports with Irish families who'd never tasted them before. The dining room became what it was always meant to be, a melting pot actually melting. Crew members participated in the unusual atmosphere. Stewards who'd maintained professional distance all voyage suddenly shared rumours about New York's best markets. Cooks sent out experimental extra dishes. Could that have been actual parsley garnish on tonight's stew? Even the strict rotation system seemed to pause a few minutes longer between seatings, allowing conversations to reach natural conclusions rather than abrupt endings. Small celebrations erupted spontaneously. A birthday discovered during conversation turned into a shared affair, with pocket treats appearing from hidden reserves. Someone produced a bottle not entirely comprised of tea, and remarkably, no steward swooped in to confiscate it. A makeshift band formed from whatever instruments passengers carried. Harmonicas, spoons tapped on glasses, a single dented trumpet rescued from a trunk below decks. Orders came out slightly slower but warmer, as if the cooks had decided presentation mattered tonight. Bread baskets were replenished before being fully emptied. Awkward attempts at plating appeared, vegetables arranged with vague artistic intention rather than just dumped beside protein. It might have been the staff's quiet nod to nearing journey's end, or perhaps just the accumulated fatigue of 4 days non-stop work. Clean-up proceeded at half speed. Instead of whisking away dishes the moment last bites were taken, stewards allowed tables to sit a while longer. The usual clatter of stacking plates gave way to lazy single-item carry trips. Even the dishwashers seemed less frantic behind their steam clouds, exchanging words with servers rather than just gestured commands. That industrial food machine everyone had depended upon was winding down for the night in no particular hurry. The room itself appeared subtly transformed in this unusual twilight. Electric lights seemed warmer than their usual harsh glare. Lingering food smells carried nostalgic notes absent from previous meals. Was that actual rosemary in the air? Laughter echoed off walls that had mostly absorbed sound before, creating an uncharacteristic buoyancy. If the Titanic had a golden hour, this was it. That fleeting moment when everything works exactly as intended before disaster strikes. Passengers departed differently too. No rushed goodbyes to claim bunks or avoid the next seating. People lingered at tables exchanging addresses, making vague promises to reconnect in America. Children were allowed to finish elaborate bread sculptures rather than having them cleared away. Someone started a round of folk songs that drifted through the room as patrons reluctantly headed for the exits, humming along until the last possible moment. None of this was planned. No captain's orders encouraged kindness between seatings. No corporate policy dictated warmer tea on final nights. This shift emerged organically from 700 people simultaneously sensing, though not articulating, that something was ending. The stiffness of formal travel gave way to the natural human impulse for connection when facing transition. They didn't know they were preparing for death, only that they needed to prepare for something. The room's architecture played its final trick. Those long communal tables designed to discourage intimacy now facilitated it perfectly. Benches that had kept strangers at awkward distances now allowed easy leaning into conversations. The identical plain dishes that prevented status competitions became equalizers, allowing shared experiences. Every utilitarian feature White Star Line included to maintain order now conspired to create unexpected community. By unspoken consensus, the usual utilitarian chewing became actual dining. People tasted rather than simply consumed, commented on flavors rather than just calorie counts. The institutional margarine somehow spread easier tonight. The normally bulletproof bread seemed crustier outside yet softer within. Whether the food actually improved or passengers simply paid attention for once was irrelevant. Perception created its own reality. Even the galley's noise changed character. The usual harsh metallic clatter softened into something almost musical. Pots nested carefully rather than slammed together. Knife work less frenetic against cutting boards. Orders travelled between cooks calmly rather than being shouted over steam clouds. That industrial kitchen designed to process human hunger with machine efficiency briefly remembered it was feeding actual humans. The dishes told their own story once cleared. More bread crusts remained than usual. Nobody feeling the need to scrape every last calorie tonight. Stew bowls showed unusual patterns, half-eaten portions left casually, rather than methodically emptied. Teacups sat with dregs cooling inside, rather than being instantly snatched for washing. These small acts of waste would have horrified the thrifty cooks earlier in the voyage. Now they simply reflected confidence that more food would always come. Children absorbed these unspoken lessons best. They noticed how adults lingered over final sips rather than gulping them down. Saw how arguments over bread allocation ceased completely tonight. Felt the permission to play rather than just eat. Even decades later, survivors would recall this final meal with uncanny clarity. Not for the food, but for the rare sensation of being truly present at a table, rather than rushing through a required chore. As passengers finally drifted toward their cabins, the dining room took on its evening emptiness differently. Normally, this was when stewards rushed to reset for breakfast, but tonight they moved slowly, almost reverently. Someone wiped down tables with unusual thoroughness. Another carefully aligned each salt cellar perfectly. A third stacked chairs with extra care. These small rituals suggested either excellent crew discipline or unconscious preparation for an ending none could yet name. The machines wound down with similar deliberation. Steam valves hissed to quiet rather than screaming shut. Ovens cooled gradually instead of being banked abruptly. Dish racks filled methodically rather than being crammed to bursting. Even the industrial bread mixer received an uncharacteristic wipe-down after use. Whether professional pride or deeper intuition, the kitchen shutdown that night approached ceremony. Leftovers told their own story. That uneaten birthday crust carefully preserved rather than being tossed back in the bread bin. Tea leaves saved for possible reuse despite ample stores in the hold. These small acts of conservation contradicted the evening's apparent abundance, as if some part of the staff knew instinctively that waste was no longer an option. Long after most passengers slept, the dining room lingered in wakefulness. A few nocturnal souls played cards under dimmed lights. Couples stole quiet conversations at corner tables. Stragglers nursed final cups of tea while reading letters from home. The usual strict lights-out policy went unenforced. Nobody seemed to mind the room staying open late for once. This wasn't recklessness, just humanity asserting itself against rigid schedules one last time. When the collision finally came, it registered barely at all in the dining spaces. A faint shudder through tableware. A slight tilt to watering glasses. Staff exchanged glances more than words. Something wrong, but not yet alarming. The kitchen's night crew debated whether to start emergency coffee preparations or wait for orders. Someone joked the helmsman must have spotted an extra-large iceberg worth veering for. Laughter followed, but nervous now. First-class stewards arriving in search of their third-class counterparts changed the mood instantly. Their carefully controlled expressions said everything the official announcements wouldn't. The kitchen's residual warmth turned suddenly stifling, its orderly systems utterly irrelevant. That elaborate machine built to feed hundreds with clockwork precision had no protocol for this final course. Only silence, and then chaos. The dining room's rhythms couldn't save them, but they gave them something rarer: dignity. For those fleeting days, third-class passengers weren't just cargo. They were people sharing tables, nodding over stew, learning silence could be companionship. The White Star Line calculated every calorie and minute, yet couldn't suppress the human stubbornness to make even this feel like living. So, tell me in the comments, would you have trusted that mysterious stew? Could you stomach 4 straight days of bread that doubled as construction material? For all its flaws, that cramped saloon offered one indelible lesson: sometimes survival isn't about the food, but who you break bread with.